Sarah Martinez had been serving coffee at the Navy Officers Club for 3 years, but she had never seen the dining room fall silent like this before. The usual chatter of naval officers discussing missions and deployments continued around her as she moved between tables with practiced grace, refilling cups and clearing plates. At 26, she had become nearly invisible to most of the high-ranking officials who frequented the establishment, just another face in the background of their important conversations. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at 5:30, tied her dark hair back into a neat ponytail, and began preparing the dining room for the breakfast rush. The Officers Club was located on the prestigious Coronado Naval Base in San Diego, and it attracted some of the most decorated military personnel in the country. Sarah had grown accustomed to serving admirals, captains, and commanders, treating each with the same professional courtesy, regardless of their rank. She had taken this job after dropping out of college when her father became ill. The medical bills had mounted quickly, and her family needed the steady income more than she needed her degree in communications. What started as a temporary solution had stretched into years, but Sarah didn't complain. The work was honest, the tips were decent, and she had developed genuine friendships with some of the regular staff. As the morning progressed, Sarah noticed an unusual tension in the air. Several tables of officers were speaking in hushed tones, glancing frequently at their phones and checking their watches. Something was happening, but as civilian staff, Sarah wasn't privy to military operations or emergencies. She had learned long ago not to ask questions about the conversations she overheard. Around 8:15, Admiral Robert Blackwood entered the dining room. Sarah recognized him immediately. He was impossible to miss. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, Admiral Blackwood commanded attention wherever he went. He was the base commander and had a reputation for being both brilliant and demanding. Sarah had served him coffee dozens of times over the years, and he had never acknowledged her presence beyond a curt nod. The Admiral took his usual table near the large windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Sarah approached with the coffee pot, moving quietly as she always did. She had perfected the art of being helpful without being intrusive, filling cups and retreating before her presence could disrupt important conversations. As she poured his coffee, Admiral Blackwood's phone buzzed. He answered it immediately, his voice dropping to the serious tone that indicated official business. Sarah continued her work, clearing the adjacent table while staying within earshot purely by coincidence. She wasn't eavesdropping. The Admiral's voice carried naturally across the quiet morning air. "Yes, I understand the situation," Admiral Blackwood said into his phone. "We need someone with those specific qualifications immediately. The mission parameters have changed, and we can't afford any delays." Sarah moved to the next table, wiping down surfaces and arranging place settings. She had heard countless similar conversations over the years: urgent missions, changing parameters, critical deadlines. The military world operated on a different timeline than civilian life, where everything could shift in an instant. "No, Lieutenant Commander Phillips is already deployed," the Admiral continued, his frustration evident. "We need someone else, someone with the same training but available for immediate deployment. Check the reserve lists again." Sarah refilled water glasses at a nearby table, her movements automatic after years of practice. She had developed the ability to work efficiently while her mind wandered to other things: her father's upcoming doctor's appointment, her younger brother's college applications, the evening shift she had picked up at a local restaurant to help make ends meet. The Admiral's conversation grew more intense. "That's not acceptable. We have a narrow window of opportunity, and we need someone who can handle both the technical aspects and the communication requirements. This isn't a standard operation." Sarah approached another table where two captains were reviewing what appeared to be mission briefings. As she poured their coffee, she caught fragments of their conversation about a reconnaissance mission that had encountered unexpected complications. One of the captains mentioned something about a communications specialist who had been injured, leaving a critical gap in their operational capacity. Moving back toward Admiral Blackwood's table, Sarah noticed that his conversation had become even more urgent. He was flipping through what appeared to be personnel files on his tablet, his jaw set in the determined expression she had seen countless times when he was solving complex problems. "We've gone through every available communications officer," he said into the phone. "There has to be someone we're missing, someone with the right background who can step in immediately." Sarah reached for the coffee pot to offer him a refill, but Admiral Blackwood held up a hand to indicate he was fine. She stepped back respectfully, but something in his tone made her pause. There was a desperation there that she had never heard before from the usually composed commander. "What about reservists who haven't been activated recently?" Admiral Blackwood asked. "Or former active duty who might be willing to return for a critical mission?" Sarah began clearing a table that had been vacated minutes earlier, stacking plates and gathering silverware. Her movements were quiet and efficient, honed by years of working around sensitive military conversations. She had long ago learned to be present but unnoticed, a skill that served her well in this environment. The Admiral's voice rose slightly, betraying his mounting frustration. "I don't care if it's unconventional. We need someone with advanced communications training and language skills who can integrate with the team immediately. Every hour we delay puts the entire operation at risk." As Sarah loaded her tray with dirty dishes, she found herself thinking about her own background before she had taken this job. Few people at the officers' club knew that she had spent 2 years in the Navy before her father's illness forced her to leave. She had trained as a communications specialist and had been considered one of the most promising young officers in her unit before personal circumstances changed everything. Her call sign during her brief military career had been Phoenix, a nickname that reflected her ability to find solutions when communication systems failed or became compromised. Her commanding officers had praised her quick thinking and natural aptitude for complex technical operations. But that felt like a lifetime ago now, buried under years of serving coffee and clearing tables. Admiral Blackwood ended his phone call and immediately dialed another number. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders as he waited for someone to answer. When they did, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a commander running out of options. "Colonel Martinez," he said, and Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. The name stopped her cold. Colonel Martinez had been her commanding officer during her time in the Navy, the man who had tried to convince her to stay when she submitted her resignation. She hadn't spoken to him in over 3 years, but hearing his name in Admiral Blackwood's conversation sent a shock of recognition through her system. "I know it's been a while," Admiral Blackwood continued, "but I'm calling about one of your former communications specialists. I need someone with advanced technical skills and language capabilities for an immediate deployment. Do you remember Sarah Martinez, call sign Phoenix?" The coffee pot slipped from Sarah's hand, clattering against the tray with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet dining room. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned in her direction, and Admiral Blackwood's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers with an expression of dawning realization. In that moment, as the room held its collective breath, Sarah understood that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collide with the military world she had left behind. The Admiral continued to stare at her, his phone still pressed to his ear, as if he were seeing her for the first time, despite the hundreds of interactions they had shared over the past 3 years. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications that Sarah couldn't yet fully comprehend. She stood frozen, tray in hand, aware that something fundamental had just shifted in ways she couldn't control or predict. Admiral Blackwood slowly lowered his phone, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The dining room remained unnaturally quiet, as if the entire space was holding its breath. Sarah felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. After 3 years of being invisible, she suddenly felt exposed under the intense scrutiny of one of the Navy's most respected commanders. "Phoenix," Admiral Blackwood said quietly, testing the call sign like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Sarah Martinez, former communications specialist, second class, specialized in advanced encryption protocols and multilingual operations." Sarah set down her tray with trembling hands. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The formal response came automatically, muscle memory from her military training overriding her civilian instincts. The Admiral stood slowly, his considerable height making him even more imposing. "You've been serving me coffee for 3 years, and you never mentioned your naval service?" "It wasn't relevant to my duties here, sir," Sarah replied, though even she could hear how inadequate the response sounded. The truth was more complicated. She had deliberately buried that part of her life, compartmentalizing her military experience as something that belonged to a different person entirely. Colonel Martinez's voice could be heard faintly through the phone that Admiral Blackwood still held. The Admiral raised it back to his ear without breaking eye contact with Sarah. "Colonel, I'm going to need to call you back. I believe I've found our solution." The other officers in the dining room began to understand that they were witnessing something significant. Conversations resumed, but at a much lower volume, with many people stealing glances at Sarah and the Admiral. She felt like she was standing in a spotlight, exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. "We need to talk," Admiral Blackwood said, gesturing toward a smaller private dining room adjacent to the main area. "Now." Sarah looked around frantically, suddenly aware of her coffee-stained apron and civilian clothes. "Sir, I'm working. I can't just leave my station." "Consider yourself temporarily reassigned," the Admiral replied with the kind of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. He turned to the dining room manager, who had appeared with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Henderson, Ms. Martinez will be unavailable for the rest of her shift. Please adjust accordingly." The manager nodded quickly, clearly recognizing that something beyond her understanding was taking place. Sarah untied her apron with shaking hands, feeling like she was shedding one identity for another. The transformation felt both natural and terrifying. The private dining room was smaller and more intimate, with a single round table surrounded by comfortable chairs. Admiral Blackwood gestured for Sarah to sit, then took the seat across from her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken questions filling the space between them. "Why didn't you tell me?" Admiral Blackwood asked finally. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered and chaotic. "Because that person doesn't exist anymore, sir. When I left the Navy, I left everything behind. My service record, my training, my call sign, all of it became irrelevant the moment I walked out of Camp Pendleton with my discharge papers." "People don't just stop being who they are," the Admiral replied. "Skills like yours don't disappear because you change jobs." "Maybe not," Sarah said, "but priorities do. My father was dying, Admiral. He needed experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover, and my family needed someone who could work multiple jobs to keep us afloat. The Navy couldn't give me that flexibility." Admiral Blackwood nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. "I remember reviewing your resignation request. Colonel Martinez fought hard to keep you. He said you were one of the most naturally gifted communications specialists he'd ever trained." Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with regret. "The Colonel was kind to me, but I made my choice, and I've lived with it for 3 years. And now I need you to consider making a different choice," Admiral Blackwood said, leaning forward. "We have a situation that requires exactly your skill set. A reconnaissance team is trapped behind enemy lines in Eastern Europe. Their communications specialist was injured in an explosion, and they've been operating with minimal contact for 72 hours. Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite herself. What kind of communications equipment are they using? Advanced encrypted systems with multiple backup protocols. They need someone who can establish secure contact with command, coordinate extraction logistics, and possibly interface with local allied forces. The area requires fluency in both Russian and German. Sarah's mind raced. She had trained extensively on the systems Admiral Blackwood described, and she was fluent in both required languages. Her father had been a linguistics professor before his illness, and he had insisted that his children learn multiple languages from an early age. It was one of the qualifications that had made her so valuable during her military service. How long would the deployment last? She asked, surprising herself by considering the possibility. 2 weeks maximum. You'd deploy with a small extraction team tomorrow morning. The mission is classified at the highest levels, but I can tell you that 5 American lives depend on re-establishing reliable communications within the next 48 hours. Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The view was familiar. She had looked out at this same stretch of water countless times while serving coffee to officers who were planning missions she could never be part of. Now she was being invited back into that world, but the invitation came with complications she couldn't ignore. "My father just started a new treatment protocol," she said quietly. "He has appointments 3 times a week, and someone needs to drive him because the medication affects his vision. My mother works full-time, and my brother is still in high school. We could arrange for military medical support during your deployment," Admiral Blackwood offered. "Transportation, nursing assistance, whatever your family needs." Sarah turned back to face him, seeing genuine concern in his expression. "Why me, Admiral?" "There have to be other qualified communications specialists who are actually still in the military. Because sometimes the best person for a job is the one who understands what's really at stake," he replied. "You left the military to take care of your family. That tells me you understand the value of bringing people home safely. These 5 soldiers have families too, and they're counting on someone with your specific qualifications to help make that happen." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a familiar burden. During her time in the Navy, she had prided herself on being the person others could depend on when communications failed and situations became desperate. She had earned her call sign Phoenix because she could bring dead communication systems back to life, often in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. "I'm out of practice," Sarah said, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. She had kept up with technological developments out of curiosity, and her language skills remained sharp thanks to her work with the diverse military community at the Officers Club. "Muscle memory doesn't disappear," Admiral Blackwood replied, "and we'll have a full briefing team ready to bring you up to speed on any equipment modifications that have occurred since your discharge." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to imagine herself back in uniform, back in the world of tactical communications and high-stakes operations. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that she was satisfied with her civilian life, but standing here now, she realized how much she had missed the sense of purpose that came with military service. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "what happens when the mission is over? Do I go back to serving coffee like nothing happened?" Admiral Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. "That would be up to you, but I suspect that once Phoenix spreads her wings again, she might find it difficult to return to the nest." The reference to her call sign sent a shiver through Sarah. She had almost forgotten how it felt to be known by that name, to be the person others turned to when everything else had failed. Phoenix, the bird that rose from ashes, reborn and stronger than before. "I need to call my family," Sarah said finally. "I need to make sure they'll be okay without me." "Of course," Admiral Blackwood replied, standing as well. "But Sarah, I need an answer within the hour. These soldiers don't have time for extended deliberation." As Sarah reached for the door handle, Admiral Blackwood spoke once more. "For what it's worth, I think Colonel Martinez was right about you. Some people are meant for extraordinary things even when ordinary circumstances try to convince them otherwise." Sarah paused at the door, her hand frozen on the handle. The choice before her would determine not just the next 2 weeks of her life, but possibly the direction of her entire future. Outside the window, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward horizons she had once dreamed of exploring in service to her country. Sarah sat in her car outside the officers' club, phone pressed to her ear as she explained the situation to her mother. The conversation was more difficult than she had anticipated. Her mother's voice carried 3 years of accumulated worry about their family's financial stability and her father's health. "Mija, are you sure about this?" her mother asked, using the Spanish endearment that always made Sarah feel like a child again. "We've managed to build a stable life here. Your father is responding well to the new treatment, and you have steady work. Why risk all of that for something that might be dangerous?" Sarah understood her mother's concerns, but she also heard something else in her voice, a note of pride that her daughter was being called upon for something important. "They're arranging for Dad's medical support while I'm gone. Better support than we can afford on our own. And Mom, 5 soldiers are trapped. They need someone with my specific skills to bring them home." There was a long pause before her mother responded. "Your father wants to talk to you." Sarah's chest tightened as she heard the phone being transferred. Her father's voice, weakened by illness and medication, but still carrying the authority of a former professor, came through clearly. "Sarah, do you remember when you were 12 and that boy Jimmy Castellanos fell into the old quarry?" he asked. The memory came flooding back immediately. Jimmy had been showing off for friends when he slipped and fell 20 feet into an abandoned limestone quarry that had partially filled with water. He couldn't swim well, and the steep walls made it impossible for him to climb out on his own. "I remember," Sarah said quietly. "Everyone else stood at the edge, arguing about what to do and whether it was safe to help. But you didn't hesitate. You tied a rope around your waist and went down after him, even though you were scared. Do you remember what you told me when I asked you why you did something so dangerous?" Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, remembering her 12-year-old self standing dripping wet next to a shivering but safe Jimmy Castellanos. "I told you that being scared didn't matter as much as knowing that someone needed help and I could provide it." "Exactly," her father said, his voice growing stronger. "You've never been able to ignore someone who needs help when you have the skills to provide it. It's who you are, Mija. It's who you've always been. 3 years of serving coffee hasn't changed that. But what about your treatment? What about the family?" "The family will be fine for 2 weeks. Your brother can drive me to appointments. It's time he learned more responsibility anyway. And Sarah, if you don't do this, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened to those 5 soldiers. That's not a burden I want you to carry." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her car for several more minutes, watching naval personnel move purposefully across the base. She had 40 minutes left to give Admiral Blackwood her answer, but in her heart she already knew what it would be. Her father was right. She couldn't live with herself if she let fear prevent her from helping people who desperately needed her skills. When Sarah returned to the officers' club, she found Admiral Blackwood in the same private dining room, surrounded by tablets, phones, and what appeared to be preliminary mission briefings. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral but expectant. "I'll do it," Sarah said simply. Admiral Blackwood nodded once, as if he had expected this answer. "Good. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Your deployment briefing begins in 2 hours, and you'll need to be fitted for equipment and receive updated security clearances." "Admiral," Sarah said before he could continue with the logistics, "I want to understand exactly what happened to the team that's trapped. What kind of communications failure are we dealing with?" Admiral Blackwood gestured for her to sit, then activated a secure tablet. The reconnaissance team was monitoring suspected weapons movements in a remote area near the Ukrainian border. They were using standard encrypted communications protocols when their position was compromised by enemy forces using advanced signal detection equipment. Sarah leaned forward, her technical training engaging automatically. They were discovered through their communication signatures? Exactly. The team's communications specialist, Lieutenant Rodriguez, attempted to switch to backup encryption protocols, but an explosion damaged both his equipment and injured him severely. Since then, they've been limited to brief, low-power transmissions that provide minimal information and can't support extraction coordination. What kind of equipment will I have available? Admiral Blackwood swiped to another screen showing technical specifications. Latest generation encrypted communications array, portable satellite uplink capability, and emergency backup systems. You'll also carry specialized equipment designed to interface with older NATO systems in case you need to coordinate with local allied forces. Sarah studied the specifications, her mind already working through potential communication strategies. The equipment was more advanced than anything she had trained on during her active duty, but the underlying principles remained the same. What's the extraction timeline? 48 hours maximum from the time you establish contact. The area is becoming increasingly unstable, and we have a narrow window when friendly aircraft can safely operate in that airspace. For the next hour, Admiral Blackwood walked Sarah through every aspect of the mission. She would deploy with a 4-person extraction team led by Major David Chen, a special operations veteran with extensive experience in hostile territory operations. The team would parachute into a remote area approximately 15 miles from the trapped reconnaissance unit's last known position. Sarah's role would be to establish secure communications with both the trapped team and command headquarters, coordinate the extraction logistics, and maintain communication security throughout the operation. If necessary, she would also serve as a translator when interfacing with local allied forces who might assist with the extraction. "There's something else you need to know," Admiral Blackwood said as the briefing concluded. "The trapped reconnaissance team includes someone you knew during your active duty. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos. She was in your advanced communications training class." Sarah felt a shock of recognition. Maria had been her closest friend during their training, and they had maintained contact for several months after Sarah's discharge before gradually losing touch. Learning that Maria was among the trapped soldiers added a personal dimension to the mission that both motivated and terrified Sarah. "Is she injured?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Unknown. We haven't received detailed casualty reports since their communications were compromised. But Sarah, I need you to understand that personal connections can't influence your operational decisions. These 5 soldiers are all equally important, and your job is to bring them all home safely." "I understand, sir." Admiral Blackwood stood and extended his hand. "Welcome back to active duty, Communications Specialist Martinez. Your temporary reactivation is effective immediately." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settling over her shoulders like a familiar coat. As they walked back toward the main dining room, she caught sight of herself in a mirror and was startled by what she saw. Already, her posture had changed. Her shoulders were straighter, her expression more focused and determined. The dining room staff watched with curiosity as Admiral Blackwood escorted Sarah toward the exit. Mrs. Henderson approached with obvious concern about the sudden disruption to the morning routine. "Don't worry about her shifts," Admiral Blackwood told the manager. "Ms. Martinez will be unavailable for approximately 2 weeks due to urgent family matters. Please arrange coverage accordingly." As they walked toward the base headquarters building where Sarah's official reactivation would be processed, Admiral Blackwood spoke quietly. "You know, in 3 years of having you serve my coffee, I never once suspected your background. You created quite an effective civilian identity." "Maybe too effective," Sarah replied, surprised by her own honesty. I think I convinced myself as much as everyone else that I was satisfied with that life. And now? Sarah looked up at the American flag flying above the headquarters building, its fabric snapping in the Pacific breeze. Now I remember why I loved wearing the uniform in the first place. Some jobs are more than just work, they're callings. I think I forgot that for a while. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in a military supply room being fitted for combat gear she hadn't worn in 3 years. The uniform felt different than she remembered, heavier with responsibility, but also somehow more natural than the civilian clothes she had become accustomed to wearing. As she adjusted her equipment belt, Sarah caught sight of her name tape being attached to her uniform jacket. Below it, barely visible, was a small patch with a phoenix rising from flames. Call sign Phoenix was officially back on active duty, and somewhere in Eastern Europe, 5 American soldiers were about to discover that their prayers for rescue had been answered by someone who had once served them coffee and was now risking everything to bring them home.